We will be posting the original English audio in a recording at a later date. And we're going to work on seeing if we can add subtitles in closed captioning in Spanish. We'll see what we can do. You can turn your video on or leave it off throughout the day today, throughout this meeting. We understand that you need to take care of yourself and your families. Many of you are at home or multitasking with other jobs while you're here, and that's totally fine and a part of the magic of Zoom. You're invited to update your profile name and add pronouns if you'd like. To do this, if you look at the picture, you probably could find the picture of yourself. There should, at the upper right corner, there are 3 dots in a blue box. If you click on those, there's an option to rename. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. Leave your name as it is. That's fine. Please hold more specific questions until after the presentation. We will leave the chat open because at least for yesterday, it worked really well to have people provide some feedback and towards the end start to ask a few questions that we bring to the larger group. But in general, please hold questions. Please jot them down though and be ready to ask. We'll have a time to do that. I encourage you to use the reaction and raise hand functions. There's a little picture of that on the screen here. This is a really great way to let the speakers know and let people know if you're loving it, if you're in agreement. It's just a nice way that we don't have in person to engage. So I highly encourage using those as you see fit. So like yesterday, as well as today, we're talking about, today will be very, very much focused on bringing together both today and yesterday around communities who have experienced structural barriers to access. And with that, and there are also people here today that are joining for the first time, and we're all in different positions socially. So please keep this in mind as we go through and as we are all wrestling with how to do our work better in our distinct roles. So with that said, please, these are some agreements to keep in mind. And in our second part of today, we'll have breakout rooms. And so please hold on to these while we move into the breakout rooms as well. First, everyone has something to contribute, and you are supposed to be here. You may think, oh, I'm not an expert on X, Y, or Z, but we are all experts and we all have value and something to contribute. Consider those power dynamics that are very real. If you're somebody who tends to speak up and this is a good time to pause a little bit longer. But I do encourage you to speak up, but giving that pause as well. If you're somebody who holds back, this may be a space I encourage you to put it out there. If you're feeling there's something to contribute, please do. You can contribute in chat or verbally, depending on your comfort as well. That's another beautiful thing of having these virtual events. This next point is one of my favorites and one I'm working on every day. Embrace those imperfections, embrace those mistakes. These are conversations that need to happen. We will do our best to not perpetuate harm, not perpetuate the inequities that we know exist, but we are all coming into this in different places. And so embrace those imperfections, embrace those mistakes. And also, please know too, if something happens and you're like, oh, that didn't feel right, and it feels comfortable, let me know. I'm happy to connect. A single story is incomplete. That will become very clear today as the presentations from today as well as yesterday. There's always room and for broader stories, and it's a big motivator for today and for this event. I'm going to wave my hand because my light turns off. Be ready with that single story. Be ready to experience some discomfort. Pay attention to your body. Also, as we talk through today, you may need to step away, and do so if you need to step away. If you're in a breakout room and you're like, man, this is not working for me, take care of yourself. And finally, my least favorite, I do identify as a researcher and I like to measure things. Expect a lack of closure. Oh, I hate it. Some of you may be like, yeah, this is messy. This is the beginning of conversation. This may be the middle of a conversation. This may be an ongoing conversation that you've been having your whole life. So know that we're all coming in different places. Okay. Wrong way. Oops. Oh, geez. There I go, being imperfect. Okay. Guiding questions. So today we're going to return to the guiding questions that we introduced yesterday. And I believe someone can help us put those in the chat right now in a separate document that's on Google, a Google document. And these questions will be the focus of our discussion. So if you're someone who likes to know what's coming, please take a look at these as we go through. We're not restricted to these questions, but these are some nice things to focus on. So those are available there. And then finally, also being added to the chat, hopefully someone can help me do that because multitasking is not my deal. There's a research sharing tool that's available on the event page. We're also going to add into the chat a place to continue to contribute to this. If you have research evaluation, we also have created a additional sharing tool. Many of you are coming from some amazing organizations doing great work and have websites and have places to connect. So there's two sharing tool invitations, and those will be distributed again, and we'll update them after the event. I'm also going to work with Jenny Mendoza from the Early Learning Division around what we can do with this sharing tool to extend beyond today's event, because there are such great, amazing projects going on today, or right now in Oregon. And my hope is that we continue to connect across those and learn about each other's work and make it better. Thank you, Michaela. So for today, we are spotlighting research that centers on the early childcare and education experiences of Native communities in Oregon, as well as continuing dialogue, bringing in also the content from yesterday. Thank you, Leslie, for sharing the guiding questions as well. So today we're going to start. I'm going to introduce, first I'm going to introduce David Mandel, who's going to provide a welcome from the Early Learning Division and share a little around a land acknowledgement. Then I'll introduce Sergio Salazar, and then he'll take it away from there to introduce our first panel, and we'll see how and the schedule for today. Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and just a warm welcome to what I know is going to be an exciting follow-up to yesterday's meeting. As Megan mentioned, my name is David Mandel. I'm the Chief of Policy and Research at the Early Learning Division, and it's my honor this morning to be getting us started with our land acknowledgement today. So as we begin our time together today, we would like to open in a new way and continue to reflect on our roles and responsibilities disrupting systems of oppression. Land acknowledgements don't exist in the past. Colonialism is a current and ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. And we'd also really like to bring the land acknowledgement today also into perspective on this particular gathering. Many of us convene as researchers, and it's important to recognize and understand the role of researchers and researchers have played and continue to play in erasing, harming, and oppressing tribal communities. In our work with our partners, we commit to strive to be an example in collecting and using data, as well as conducting research and evaluation studies in a way to promote equity and justice while redressing harm. We would also like to invite you to learn more about the shared history of Oregon as tribes within Oregon's borders have developed with the Oregon Department of Education. And I'm going to put into the chat a link to the Essential Understandings of Native Americans in Oregon document I was just referencing. So with that, I would like to turn it back to Megan, and again, just welcome everyone today.
Thank you, David. Okay, so at this point, I would like to introduce Sergio Salazar from AB Cultural Drivers. Sergio is a bilingual Spanish-English university professor based out of Guadalajara, Mexico. He may be familiar. He presented yesterday along with Nelda and colleagues. He is an associate researcher at AB Cultural Drivers, and we are incredibly lucky to have him facilitating today and leading us through this experience together. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. Take it away, Sergio.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'm really glad to be here, sharing with you this second day of our roundtable. So, I hope we will have a great second day. We will be able to continue yesterday's discussion. As you know, we are here to expand our knowledge on the current issues in early education dealing with diversity. And we would like for each of us to share and learn the experiences that we have on some research projects as the ones that were presented yesterday. So for today's presentation, I think we will be able to identify these new approaches to research processes, especially today with indigenous populations and Native Americans. Native American populations as well. So I hope we can really learn and maybe start bridging what we learned yesterday from the experiences of our panelists today. So I think, as Megan said, we will have a Q&A session after the presentation, and then we'll have a break, and then we'll come back to do some breakout groups with these guiding questions that we prepared as a team before. So I'm going to start by presenting or introducing our panel. Our speakers are Valeria Atanasio. She's a Tribal Affairs Manager at the Early Learning Division. She will be joined by Sara Cayano and Ingrid Andersson. They are both researchers at the Portland State University. So thank you very much for being here. And their presentation is titled Indigenous First Steps, Family, Culture, and Community. And they will be talking about, they will present this, how's their work being with this planning grant to promote cultural specific early learning programs for this American Indian or American Native children in the state of Oregon. And they have the aim of developing this childhood professional development certificate, right? So yesterday we talked a bit about this professional development certifications, or all the importance that has the professional development in our field. So they will be talking more about this grant and the planning that they have been doing. So they will share about this work. They are at the early stages of their work. So I think that will be very interesting for us. And I'm also sure they will they could be able to use our feedback as well. So I'm sure we'll learn a lot. And well, please use the chat as Megan said, and also keep note of your questions so we could come back in a few minutes to ask and react to their presentation. So please go on. I don't know if it's Valeria who's going to start, I think, or Ingrid. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I always like to double check. Thank you so much. We are all thrilled to be here today to share with you about our project. My name is Ingrid Anderson, and you're going to be hearing Valeria and Sarah's voice as they talk through the project. The Indigenous First Steps, I'm going to give a little background and then we'll sort of jump in. The Indigenous First Steps grant was funded by the Student Success Dollars from the Oregon Department of Education in 2020-21. And really the purpose of that grant was to create a framework to rethink what early learning looks like with Indigenous strands of knowing and Indigenous knowledges, honoring culture and language and traditions. And so our work was really designed not to develop fully this certificate, but to interview and speak with, and really from a perspective of listening sessions, hear from tribal elders, from cultural bearers, from parents, from community, from early childhood educators, to build an understanding of stories. And so this project looks and feels a little different than maybe traditional research if you are in the research field or if you're used to reading research. And so what we want to do today is represent the approach of storing, which is grounded in Indigenous methodologies, which was the framework and the basis for our work. And so today you're going to hear a series of stories that will reveal the experiences, but also will reflect how we navigated through the research process. And only at the end we'll give you the structural framework. So we're going to start with the experience and then move to the structure and what we're learning and where we're going from here. Our work really is done in community.
Ingrid?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure you know so that you're sharing the full screen and we're seeing your notes.
Oh, no. Okay. Thank you. Let me flip that around.
You probably are seeing the full thing.
I'm seeing, okay. So I'm going to share. All right.
Yes.
Now all right.
Thanks.
My apologies and thank you so much. You've all seen now Behind the Magic, which is like having two screens up so you can read your notes. So first and foremost, this is a partnership between members of the Indigenous First Steps leadership team, Josh Davis, Katie Holland, Valerie Switzer, Valeria Adonacio, Ali Holcomb, Carrie Green, Carrie Brown, Noreen Smokey Smith, Karen Kitchen, who all helped guide the project. Nothing was done without them. And it's really based, our framework, in community-based research, participatory research, which meant that the research questions, the work of the project, everything was done within this frame. And one of the biggest things that we're working with and still trying to navigate is changing terminology as a researcher from this sort of what I'm used to in the IRB to what language is appropriate and honoring in this space. The PSU team consisted of Dr. Maria Tenario, John Nemo, Sarah Cayano, and myself. And our evaluator is Dorothy Aguilar of Black Bear, an amazing Indigenous and researcher and knowing of methodologies. So I need to move to the next slide. Here we go. And so I'm going to turn it over to Valeria and then to Sarah, and then you'll hear a little bit from me at the end, because truly this is not my story. And so Valeria, I'm going to send it over to you.
Thank you, Ingrid. Can you guys hear me okay at this volume level? Okay, so first let me say Slush Chisan, Valeria Neganim, Valeria Atanasio Neganim. So hello all, my name is, good morning, and my name is Valeria Atanasio. I'd like to introduce myself first and foremost as an Indigenous woman, a mother to two beautiful little girls who happen to be some of Oregon's early learners, and as I like to consider a lifelong early childhood scholar. I currently work for the Early Learning Division as the Tribal Affairs Manager, where I get to work with the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon to support them and help bring together our governments to support early learning in those tribal communities. I'd like to start with a story from my early childhood that has stayed with me since I can remember. It was about the 2nd grade. My class was directed to do a project. This project was focused on family history, culture, and identity. One of the tasks that we were to do was to go home and ask questions of our parents, grandparents, other familial relatives about where we came from and who we were. I remember coming home so excited to ask my mom questions and so excited to tell the story to my classmates about who I was, and to my teacher especially. I started doing research, asking my mom which tribes we came from and why we were considered a part of the Grand Ronde people. This is one of the first conversations that I remember having with my mother about our tribal history. My mother shared that we were from 5 different tribal bands, including the Chinook, Tututni, Shoshone-Bannock, Northern Ute, and Umpqua. She shared a story of how we came to Grand Ronde. The next part of my project was to visit our school library and gather information that was available about my heritage and ancestry from books. When I went to the library, there were only about 2 books in my reading level that had information about Native American history and people, and only 1 book that actually contained any information about one of my tribal bands, the Shoshone-Bannock. For this reason, my project became a project about the Shoshone-Bannock people and not necessarily about the whole me. Now, as I mentioned before, I consider myself an early childhood scholar and lifelong learner. Someone who at different points throughout my life has contended with my identities and histories about my people and about my heritage that didn't necessarily resonate with me personally. Throughout my entire educational career, this is an example of a project that I do recall from this 2nd grade project that I was given an opportunity to dig deeper about my identity and history. As we know, in early childhood, identities, histories, and communities are extremely important when it comes to education for children, not only in early childhood, but in adolescence and for adult learners as well. It is our identities and history that connect us to the environments that we grow in, and it is in those identities and histories that allow us to become who we're meant to be. Now that I'm a mother, as I mentioned, I have a child receiving early learning services here in Oregon. My daughter, Safia, attends a tribal operated immersion language program by my tribe in Grand Ronde, Oregon. And one of the many projects that she was tasked with over the last 2 years, between the ages of 3 to 5, was to learn about her family history. In this moment, I was given the opportunity to share what my mother shared with me that long time ago in the second grade. We talked about our tribal bands. We talked about the story of how our people came to Grand Ronde and how we arrived as a tribe. We talked about our termination and our restoration. And most importantly, I think we talked about my mom. My mother's no longer with us, but in spirit. And it's one of my proudest moments that I got to share something that she had gifted me. This to me was a great example of what we speak about when we talk about Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous ways of teaching and learning. That doesn't have to occur in a standardized method, and it doesn't have to occur within a box. But we can live through our experiences and through our interactions with one another. I now, as I mentioned, represent in a professional capacity our 9 tribes in Oregon, and I am the first in my role at the Early Learning Division. And I joined the Indigenous First Steps Project leadership team to help advise and make recommendations about what's being created here. But most importantly, I think it's because I truly believe in it and I feel passionate about it. Next slide. So as we are listening, as researchers, as we're building policy and as we're moving through life, I think in general, research tends to be focused on a process that is often designed for research purpose and not the participants' culture or the experiences of our families and our children. Reciprocity is a fundamental tenet in working with Native communities, and it's one that takes time in relationship building. Research often feels rushed and asked when we want community voice, but there's limited time to make connections or build relationships, impacts the representation that we can gain from a specific community that we're asking to be present. It's important to remember that families operate in all different kinds of ways. And for many different types of families, and families, especially ones that we serve with our state-funded programs, they need the extended time to engage, and they need different types of supports in order to engage. I think in general, research, tends to be focused on specific steps, and typically, at the end of something is when we start gathering that research with folks. But I think there's an importance to learn around early integration and working with individuals to build those connections over months or years along our process from project development through the planning phases, and then to some of that more data gathering and research parts of the project. I have some reflections I'd like to share from my personal experience working on the IFS project that I think speak to both the strengths and opportunities in front of us currently where we're at. Some of the strengths I see are that this project has an intended focus on decolonizing the experience of online learning. This focuses on the impact of existing structures to be able to reach people and for people to be able to see themselves in the things that they're learning about and the material that they're studying. Another strength of this project to me has been the approach that the research team has taken by not pushing the group on moving too fast or making decisions, even if it means that all our research goals are not met. Historically, for Native people, how we make decisions has been that we meet, in person. We build that relationship and we meet until we come to agreement. And that takes time. The importance of the human experience as well has been brought to light within this process, telling our own stories, letting our stories be a part of what we're doing and our purpose here. And also the importance of transparency, and that we're not going to always reach our research goals in the time that we intend, but that there is communication throughout that allows our partners to be with us in this process. And that this project is about building relationships. And the first grant is part of an ongoing process, really, to create long-term partnership and to create long-term success in the development of a 12-credit professional development certificate. So we fully intend to keep going and keep being transparent in the ending, and continued work will allow us to do so and help us co-create this alongside our tribal partners. Some opportunities for the IFS team to grow and potentially other grants to consider. As I said, earlier, Native people historically, is to meet until we come to consensus. But we don't have the same sort of process to make decisions in the ways that organizations have for timelines. So in consideration when you're doing research, especially with our Native communities, I think allowing more time for meetings and for the process to unfold naturally and organically. Meetings were about 1.5 to 2 hours that allow for conversation to begin, but not fully flow to where we want to get the details and we want to get, to the hard conversations once we're comfortable with each other. There is a high importance on meeting in person, and this has been drastically, I think, impacted our work in many of our communities in Oregon, but especially our Native families, because we're not able to do that yet. So we're still staying safe and doing our best. But I think that once we safely can do so, there is a really high importance of meeting in person and being able to provide some of that networking and time for getting to know one another and build relationships before jumping into the questions. And then one of the other areas has been to be able to hear, from the IFS team, what would curriculum look like, and to be able to see samples of work that we still haven't been able to see yet. So I think that the end can feel of this, but again, it's not the end, it's just the end of a grant. We have to remind ourselves. But I think we need to keep building the relationships and let those periods of silence not be too long. Continue building the relationships in the time that you have, and continue opening up space for people to ask questions and be part of the process, even in those periods of silence, like we're experiencing now with the grant. So those were just some of my personal experiences from this team. I think that I like the way that I'm able to contribute, not only representing who I am in my voice and my experience as an Indigenous woman and parent, but I think also, the joy that I get and the passion that I feel being able to do that for our 9 tribes here in Oregon. So I think I will stop there and just say that I'm really feeling grateful to be part of this project. And I think that the team, Ingrid and her team, are doing a wonderful job, and I'll continue to support in the ways that I can. And I'm excited to see what's developed in the near future.
Beadu, Sarah Koyano, Quadiitsk, Canyonville, Oregon, Gaal Bahamte, Nahanguadana, Ayite. Good day. My name is Sarah Koyano. I'm from Canyonville, Oregon. I'm a member of the Cow Creek people. I am currently residing in Eugene, Oregon with my family. I'm so lucky to have been involved in the Indigenous First Steps project with Ingrid and Valeria, along with other PSU community and tribal partners. I was directly involved in the listening sessions and focus groups as a facilitator, and I spent time with several tribal elders who blessed me by sharing their personal stories for this project. I'm a graduate student at PSU pursuing a doctoral degree in education leadership, and I'm a mom and a grandma. I want to start by sharing a couple of stories.
Sarah,
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but it sounds like you need to join the English channel.
Oh, how do I do that real quick?
It's at the very bottom of your screen. It should say, there should be a little interpretation picture. If you click on that and then go to English.
Are we better now?
Let's get a couple people to say yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Gotcha.
So sorry. Should I start over?
No, continue on.
Okay.
I hate to mess with the flow, but I want to make sure we all hear. Thank you.
I want to start by sharing a couple of stories. Just last week, my family and I went on a hike at Mount Pisgah Arboretum, that's a hard word to say, near my home. It was a beautiful day, and along the hike, I saw breathtaking views of the valley down below with oak, aspen, fir, and cedar trees and green grass contrasted by the beautiful blues and whites of the fall sky above, dotted with fluffy, dreamy clouds. Along the path, I heard birds and saw squirrels, who I assume were busy gathering acorns. As I walked, I noticed that the ferns had new green growth shooting up from below with an intense green that was a distinctly brighter color than the rest of the fern. I couldn't help but think about the young children beginning new educational journeys all across our state, like my grandson who started kindergarten this year. Like the fiddlehead pictured in the slide, with the new growth of the fern uncurling and reaching out, I was filled with peace and hope for the future. Another image I want you to notice is that of the park that I used to play at when I was a kid. This park is located in Southern Oregon, where I grew up. Not only did I play at the park, but my kids also played there. In fact, I very recently visited the park and saw that it was still very much the same as it was when I was a kid in the 70s. As you can see in the pictures, there's a fort with lookout towers. The openings in the towers are pointing out towards the teepees on the outside. The smaller picture in the foreground is of the fort, and it shows that inside is a cannon that is pointed out towards the entrance of the fort. As you can see, there's a young child sitting on the cannon. As a child, I used to sit in the same spot. Please hold on to the images of the fiddlehead and the fort at the park as we continue through the slides. Next slide, please. As a Native scholar, it is important that I situate myself on this land and within this story of education in Oregon. As I mentioned, I was born in Canyonville, Oregon. I'm a member of the Nahankuadana, the Cow Creek people. My father is Cree, Kalapuya, Cow Creek, and French ancestry, and my mom has Irish-Scottish ancestry. My tribal ancestors have walked on this land now called Oregon for at least the last 15,000 years or more, or as we say, since time immemorial. As Fast and Kovich point out, this act of self-situating solidifies our own individual deep relationship to place, community, land, kinship, and cosmos, and acts as resistance to erasure of our people, while dismantling the single story of indigeneity. We act in solidarity with one another as we rethink how we tell stories and unlearn colonial habits of mind. And most importantly, by acknowledging ourselves upon the land and within this story, we honor the history of our own tribal community, including our responsibility to our ancestors, current and future generations, and we participate in anti-colonial work. As I speak today, I will use the terms Native, tribal, and Indigenous interchangeably to mean the original peoples on this continent. All right, if you could go forward, yeah, there we are. Now let's get back to that picture of the fort at the park. The fort perfectly portrays the US settler colonial paradigm. what Piper et al. Calls the metaphor of the fort. With the settlers safely inside the walls of the fort, with guns and cannons pointing out, protected from the native people on the outside. The settler is portrayed as surrounded by natives, inverting the role of aggressor, so that colonialism is made to look like self-defense. The surrounded settlers in their forts are not portrayed as invaders. Rather, the natives are constructed as the problem. Here, the life forgotten is the absence produced regarding how Indigenous peoples acted in defense of their homelands, as they continue to this day. Native people and communities are still here, challenging colonialism, continuing to story, and refusing to be forgotten. Next slide, please. Indigenous research methods demand that the fort be removed, that we decolonize research by removing the enclosure and recognizing Indigenous ways of knowing and being as equally important. Indigenous research methods operate from a native worldview which predates Western research on this lands. Next slide, please. Embedded in Indigenous research methods are the key protocols of relationship, reciprocity, respect, and responsibility. Relationship, accountability, and responsibility, including developing and keeping community relationships even after research is done. As a Native person, my relational responsibilities are to myself, my family, my community, and to the participants in the project. Reciprocity involves giving back to community with action-based research that is meaningful and beneficial to the Native community. Research must respect and honor cultural and community protocols, understanding the importance of elders and culture bearers, and who is allowed to tell community stories. And finally, responsibility to Native communities and research participants, including centering community worldview, values, and cultural protocols. Next slide, please. So why does this all matter? Well, the truth is, Native realities, worldviews, values, ways of knowing and being have been minimized, erased, and devalued in everyday life in the US, including in schools across the state. The first quote I want to highlight says, "I've been immersed in American public education my whole life and was unaware of pretty much anything related to Native Americans," said a student after taking a Native American history course, presumably in college. The second quote comes directly from testimony for Oregon Senate Bill 13. April Campbell, Oregon's director of the Office of Indian Education, is discussing training she provided to Oregon educators, noting that over the course of a year, I have provided professional development to more than 1,500 educators across the state. One of the exercises that I offer is asking participants to identify the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon. Less than 1% were able to identify all 9, and more than 95% could identify only 1 to 2 tribes. Let's contrast that with the fact that Indigenous education is an inherent right of Native people, guaranteed by treaty rights, sovereign status, and federal and international law. Article 8, Section 1 of the 2007 United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People states, "Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture." And Article 15, Section 1 states, "Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, traditions, histories, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information." These are just 2 examples out of 46 articles in the UN Declaration that articulate the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples to equity, respect, and justice, while upholding the dignity and value of Indigenous cultures and knowledges, and the imperative to accurately transmit cultural knowledge to Indigenous children. Despite the UN Declaration, treaty rights, sovereign status, and federal and international law, many young Native children in Oregon do not have access to educational opportunities that value, honor, respect, and affirm their Indigenous identity and culture, nor do they see their culture and history accurately reflected back in school pedagogies, curriculums, or environments. The lack of Indigenous education in Oregon is a problem for Oregon's Native people and for all of Oregon's youngest citizens. Next slide, please. One theme, oh no, I changed that, but that's okay. It must not have saved. One theme that came up continually in the listening sessions, focus group, and elder culture bearer interviews was the theme that Native stories are important and they need to be told. The truth needs to be told. Native people need to know their history. This point was iterated over and over. Native ways of knowing are seen as an important and valued gift. Reclaiming the gift of Indigenous knowledge and early childhood education benefits Native and non-Native children alike and has the potential to transform the future of early childhood education in Oregon. As Jacob et al. Point out, Indigenous knowledges offer generative values, philosophies, conceptual frameworks, and stories that can enrich all students and society more broadly. Indigenous knowledges offer an important resource for educating all children. Native peoples have a long and dynamic history in this place and on this land now called Oregon. Rich spiritual relationships to the land, along with traditional Native knowledge systems and ways of teaching, learning, and knowing live in this place. Furthermore, Native languages, arts, stories, dances, songs, and the knowledges of nature, animals, plants, and foods have remained here. These Indigenous epistemologies and pedagogies are the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, entrenched within their lands as original peoples. But even more so, Indigenous ways of knowing are a valuable resource and a gift that can benefit all children in Oregon. Indeed, there is an opportunity for true healing on Indian lands. As Native poet Simon Ortiz so eloquently reminds us, hope and healing are very possible and maybe even inevitable on Indian lands. This America has been a burden of steel and mad death, but look now, there are flowers and a new grass and a spring wind rising from Sand Creek. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure to be able to come and talk together today. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here.
Valeria, Sarah, thank you for the gifts of your words, your experiences. It is truly humbling to be a researcher in community. And so much of what we're learning in this journey, where we are just really starting together as colleagues, co-protagonists, co-constructors, is how to do this work in ways that are respectful, how to learn new languages, how to build new ways of thinking about lifting and holding voice front and center and recessing the research paradigm. And so our conceptual model looks very different than many conceptual models. And our work really was to decolonize our own practice as researchers who are non-Indigenous, and to uphold and uplift research methodologies of the advisory team of our colleagues who are researchers who identify as Native American, American Indian, or Alaska Native. And so in that, as a Hispanic researcher who is not Native American, I had to recognize that it was not my place to hear the stories, that stories need to be told by people in their own place for their own purpose. And so my work was to come alongside, it's to have conversations, but not to live differently in this space and place. And only once the stories are told and what the community has determined may come forward into the space where we are co-constructing meaning, did members of the research team like myself start to become involved. And we're now starting the process of joint compiling, writing, referencing, vetting, and eventually finalizing what it will mean to reconstruct fully what online learning looks like, focused on Indigenous ways of knowing. And this is something really different from ourselves. This is the first part of the project. We have since put together 4 more grants requesting funding and resources. We see this as a minimum of a 10-year project and commitment on behalf of the work in the university. Because if we are truly to have relationships, if we are to value reciprocity and reciprocal relationships, then this is an ongoing step in a long-term commitment to building together what is valued by the community. And so, let's get to our last slide. I'll share with you a few of the sort of main things that the research team learned in particular. The importance of not putting traditional language from research into this. We had to work and move from this concept of co-constructing, which is very natural as a qualitative research who talks about and talks with people about their experiences, to ideas of conceptualizing and contextualizing information and stories, and knowing that was not my place to do that, and to hold in a space of waiting and learning. Looking at then to how we decolonize those data analysis methods and move away from this process of having to have meaning, which means that that there was a completely iterative process, that we had to wait and see how the community wanted to bring forward the research, that we needed to step back and realize that self-determination needed to lead the process, that was not the research team's work to be done. And so the community-based participatory research framework is incredibly helpful in creating guides to make sure that self-determination happens, and that the leadership team, their work, their advisory, their guidance, and moving from the researchers helping to set the agenda to having the agenda set by the community and the researchers following that construct. There is a strong commitment to Indigenous voices in framework, and really having to work to bracket our knowledge. We realized almost at the beginning that we could not adapt any curriculum for the project. We could not adapt any existing structures, that we really needed to start from the ground down, and that the threads, the memories, the stories gleaned from the process of listening is really becoming the basis for designing culturally responsive ways that value and prioritize and the goals of Indigenous and other teachers of Indigenous young children. We realized that it is a very, Indigenous methodologies are very iterative cyclical process, and that within the IRB, which is sort of the last realization, if you work in research, we have a process by which you have research approved at the university. And we went through 5 cycles of the IRB process in the months that we were together working, realizing that trying to construct one story at the beginning was not appropriate, and that the iterative process of learning and reflecting and changing created a new process of engaging with the systems of research in the universities themselves. And then finally, our guidance by our leadership team, who met with us monthly and sometimes bi-monthly, really to work to follow the protocols that centered Native stories and voice was critically important, and to understand that research protocols and Native American, Alaska Native protocols are different, and that the researchers had to let go of their own protocols in the process. We are still learning, we are still building, we are nowhere close to being at a place where we have finished framing the foundation, but we continue to go forward and work together. And this is our story today. Thank you so much for listening.
Wow, thank you very much. It was such a deep communication, right? What you shared with us and all your personal stories and the personal experiences. Thank you very much, Sarah and Valeria. I think we have a lot of time for questions. So I was just wondering, you were talking about the importance of, changing our frameworks in terms of the time and the timetables and the schedules and this set and fixed boxes that research has, especially in universities or with institutions. And I was wondering if you could, for the three of you, if you could tell us a bit more about how these changes translate into real life research, right? How your practices had to change in adjusting these times in order to work and to gain the confidence with the community and to have these cycles of reciprocity and these complex processes. And how does that change, or how do that changes have impact in the more formal part of the research and adapting to institutions and our timetables and our deadlines and all that. I think that's something that could open the conversation. And I'll also be happy to read in the chat if you have some questions, or if you want to also raise your hand and open your microphones, we could start this conversation.
Valeria or Sarah, would you like to start?
Yeah. One of my biggest sort of where I like to advocate is investments, where we're placing our investments, and the fact that, this is, as I shared, the first role of its kind at the early learning division. And now it's a permanent position as part of the early learning division. I think as you're thinking about investing, personnel, dollars for personnel or hiring, you're going to want to put those into tribal affairs, into people who can reach the community, who have experience with the community, and who come from that voice of that community is one of the best ways that you can begin starting to build those relationships and connections. And as far as the timelines go, I think we've learned through this process of the first grant, monies that we received that, this is a phase project, this is us thinking long-term, how we are going to sort of finance the continuation of this vision. And so I think it happens in steps because our current structures and systems maybe don't allow for some of that long-term quite yet. But the idea would be that, if you can, break it up into phases or project chunks, you can build on your vision moving forward. But definitely investment into personnel and into people who can reach communities that you'd like to include.
Thank you, Valeria. Sara?
I just wanted to, thinking about that question, I just wanted to say that when I got involved in the project, it sort of, the funding came in sort of late. And so it was all really rushed. And it was really good for me to kind of stand back as an Indigenous person to listen to the leadership group and their ideas of how to move forward and their time frame, which was different than what we thought maybe we could do. So in the end, I think we ended up being accomplishing much more rich, meaningful work by slowing down and following the lead of the leadership group. So that really, as a researcher and a scholar, that really did help me a lot to be involved in that and to learn from that experience from those super wonderful people, you know, who I consider to be my teachers, the leadership team. So.
Thank you. I mean, I don't know, Ingrid, do you have something to add or any more ideas or experiences?
It is really interesting in terms of grant and grant timelines. And that I think was something that we all talked about and worked to make very transparent in the process. And I think that we use the word tension a lot. There's this tension of a grant or a grant structure that has required outcomes against what is a natural process that honors the community in following the work. And so while we met elements of the grant requirements, we did not come out with this complete vision of what the learning strands would look like for the 12 credit professional development certificate. And what we realized is in our own, in falling into the trap of the structural elements of research, that what we thought we could accomplish in the period of time given really is something that's going to take several years to build from, but yet we have responsibilities and commitments to our communities, to the students. And so we can continue to grapple with that. And the only thing that we can do is be transparent in the process and look for ways to show the flaws in the system and to continue to work with these structures at the university, like the IRB, to work to help educate and say and show that these structures push up against what is Indigenous research methodologies. And one of the things we did pass on is we worked really hard to create a reading list of some of the current and the most well-regarded books on Indigenous methodologies, and that should be posted, and that has been really helpful. And I read in those books every week, in addition to listening to Sarah, to listening to Valeria, to following the guidelines of our advisory leadership team to make choices and decisions as I think about what next steps are in this process. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. I think that that's really helpful and really opens the spectrum of what we need to take into account, right? When starting this type of projects and these methodologies, and also adapting even to that's already written, right? It's not always the same. I don't know if you have the audience, if you participants have more questions, or because otherwise I could continue. I was also wondering you know, yesterday we were learning about the importance of stories, right? Of storytelling and knowing the stories, the personal stories. And well, today both Sara and Valeria they shared their personal stories at this um, as this point of introducing ourselves and themselves to the projects. And I was wondering how is the experience of getting to know the stories of people who's involved in your projects being, because in the project that we presented yesterday, the one about the professional development opportunities for early childhood education providers, I had the opportunity to interview one indigenous Native American provider, and what she told us was this difficult the problems or the issues they are having in getting people to share the stories and to have the opportunity to know themselves, to think of themselves as potential, providers or potential students or professional or potential researchers, right? Because sometimes, especially in Oregon, these opportunities are not always communicated to indigenous populations or to Native American groups. So I was wondering about, because I was the one doing that interview with one of our indigenous providers. She also talked about even the terminology, right? If it's Native American or if it's indigenous, and there sometimes I feel like in our state we're behind some other states in terms of the tribal and indigenous cultures. And how's your experience with getting to know these stories and people really wanting to share those? If you could talk about, because that's something that, yesterday in the first panel, they were talking about parents becoming partners in education, and then we're talking about professional development opportunities, but those are very different in some communities. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit. And I'm looking for the questions if anyone has something to ask our panelists. We still have time. So yes, please.
Well, I can speak a little bit to my experience in sort of what tribes are focused on currently as a whole in Oregon. And when you talk about like that professional development opportunity for helping not only families engage, but also reach a level of, knowing about child development, understanding their own children that they're raising, and then becoming passionate potentially about doing it for others. A lot of the tribes, have, focused their funding like on CTE or like high school, like CTE programming where they could start building that, understanding earlier, working with high school students, working with early, late, juniors, seniors in high school to learn about early childhood, to, potentially intern and work within the spaces of early care and education. Tribes are really passionate about grow your own, professional ECE people, and work really hard to make sure that there's pathways for education available and communicated widely. But I know one of the things that, and I can speak from my personal experience in Grand Ronde, is like we sometimes were met with opportunities. I know like about probably 5 years ago, we were trying to create an opportunity for people just in our community who we already knew potentially were providing familiar care, family care or child care from their home for cousins or other relatives. and trying to get them licensed or trying to get them certified. And that is it was hard. I mean, we basically had no takers at that time, because, you know, again, it's about sort of how do we remove some of those structural barriers and make sure that there's opportunity for other pathways, because it's not always going to be a credentialing system or, you know, even looking at our organ registry system, like how does that impact specifically our not only Native educators, but BIPOC educators in Oregon and people who want to take care of children and are passionate about it, but don't necessarily want to do school or go through those traditional education pathways. So I think that's something that tribes are, you know, focused on building and in partnership with what we have going on right now too, with the creation of a tribal early learning hub. I know some of our priority is set in that area of how we could, you know, enhance, you know, the state's ability and all of our systems and structures to be just more flexible and offer opportunities in different ways. So that's just my initial thoughts on it, but let Ingrid and Sarah add if they'd like to as well.
Just to add on to what Valeria just spoke about, personally for me, for my tribe down in Douglas County, our tribe just opened up very recently a preschool, and they are also working on revitalizing the language and the culture in a way that's can be shared with the children in the preschool. In fact, yesterday I just got in the mail a couple really cute books from the tribe. One is numbers and one is colors, to add to the other books that they produce that are about animals and just general Degelma words. So that's really neat. And also the tribe is involved in the Grow Your Own project with looking to get more rural teachers, just recognizing that children need to see themselves reflected in their teachers as well as the curriculum. So there's a big involvement in that area, trying to look at ways to get more tribal people in the educational careers. So that's what I know about that. And as far as working with the folks that in the listening sessions, focus groups, and the interviews with the elders and the culture bearers, I feel like it was a true blessing to me to be able to listen. I didn't do hardly any talking. It was all listening and hearing these really meaningful and important stories, which I feel like came directly from my ancestors and my relatives. And as a young child, I grew up and never learned anything about my tribal history in my education. My tribe was not mentioned once in my whole entire 12 years. And so that was very difficult as a young person, you know, with identity, trying to figure out who I am as a person and having the images portrayed in my education of, you know, Indians at Thanksgiving and Columbus and Sacagawea, and that's pretty much it. So it was very meaningful to listen to these stories from the folks that I got to interact with. And I can't tell you how much it really touched me. And so I know that this is very important work. So that's it.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we can continue with Nelda? You had one question. And if someone else has more questions, please let me know.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. I'm very delighted and honored to hear the story and some of the things that you mentioned today that are so connected to the experiences that we are having with other projects and this we presented yesterday. But I mean, in the spirit of self-growth, as you were talking, I realized that often as a multiracial, multi-ethnical person with identities and navigating the system, I hold attention often, most of the time. That it's, I would say, the most challenging thing as a professional. And I'm wondering if you feel that tension too, because navigating the system has an impact in us as people, in our health, in our mental health. And I've been doing this work for 22 years, and actually started doing my work in my native land, Mexico, with indigenous, community in the urban setting. And so I've been attuned to the work, for such a long time, but it's challenging as a research to be able to navigate and actually function itself as a navigator, as a bridge between, doing research in a way that is, honest and open and relatable, and just that feels that it's, with the community, they are doing it at the same time that benefits them, and at the same time navigating all these other systems and mindsets and colleagues, that we're all in the path of growing, and sometimes people that are making decisions that need a lot of education, honestly. And so I don't know, it's a reflection. I just want to thank you, because you made me realize how much I've been holding that tension. And I think it's part of the work, and I've owned that responsibility, and I try to uphold it the best I can. But I'm wondering, the spirit of sharing together, if you do it, and if, how you navigate that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Nelda. We definitely, I think many people can relate to you in the words that you shared. I certainly do, as I, have a lot to learn as well. I only come from Grand Ronde, but now I've been representing the 9 tribes in Oregon and having to learn about really the intricate histories related to all of our 9 tribes in Oregon. And I do struggle with this, as you mentioned. I think it's part of this work, and in sort of balancing, how much good I can do and how I can stay transparent and connected to the community, and not feel, like we're, beating a dead horse, as they say. Or, how are we making these intricate changes, in our system? And I think it's all about, those small changes, just as small changes lead to big outcomes. And I really just appreciate you sharing your experience, and know that you're not alone. And all of us probably have struggled with this, right, in our work, and how we can help our communities really thrive. And so I just wanted to acknowledge what you said and say that I'm right there with you. And I think it is a balance, and it's just so important that representation is at the table. And I think that's what keeps us motivated and keeps us going, is that we need to continue pushing, that dial. And it begins with small changes, because those really do add up. And as you can see, even look at research, how it's transformed, and how we're finding, way more methodologies and things for that qualitative research that truly impacts our communities. And that dial is shifting. So I appreciate, your 20 plus years of dedication to this.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone has more questions. I was also thinking about the importance of this, you know, how we're always trained in research, like to identify biases and like to be honest, and the reflexivity of our jobs and our projects and the different roles we have, but also in this type of projects show us how we could also use some of those biases, right? And maybe shift also the way in which we see our professional backgrounds and our personal stories as researchers, not only the stories from the communities or the people we're working with, but also to take advantage, I mean, in a positive way, not in a negative one, of those stories and those things that we're thought that are biases could be harmful for research, but they also can be very, you know, useful, and they can mean a lot of things, and they can help us like to redefine these concepts you were talking about, this importance of redefining concepts and changing terminology. And that has to do with some of the questions that we prepared for the breakout rooms next. And it was something that I was really impacted with when discussing with the team and some of their colleagues, such as, for example, Professor Nemo, was how the very concept of education needs to change, right? And what we think about quality and education. And that's one of the questions that we will see later, but that's also very important. It's not the same for everyone. It's not the same in the universities, and it's not the same, you know, the ways in which, in this case, early education, but all education occurs and needs to happen in different communities. And I don't know if you would like to, and Ingrid, Valeria, or Sara, if you want to mention something about these changes and these different concepts that we need to start sharing and redefining in terms of what education is or what quality means in different contexts. That's something we talked the last time we saw each other in the planning, right? And yeah. I think that was a very powerful idea.
So Dally and Urban, who write in sort of reconceptualizing early childhood education, call this the dilemma of colliding worlds, where we have early childhood professionals who are expected to act autonomously in classrooms with children individually, but we have systems that are increasingly pushing in structure. And so you have this dilemma between needing to act autonomously and needing to have structural outcomes and things. And what happens in that space for me is that we have to find a way to think about our structural elements that honor different ways that different communities make meaning, and realize that some of that structure is really grounded in colonial practices. And so how are we decolonizing something? But we're also looking at turning a massive barge stacked with 1 million containers, and that change is slow. And so the question becomes, how do we act both systemically and how do we act locally so that children don't have to wait, teachers don't have to wait for the system to change? Are there places that we can meet towards the middle, and that we empower educators to be able to be their authentic selves in the classroom? And so this is a tension in which part of our project is living, is in when we offer and develop and continue to evolve this 12 credit certificate, which will not fit into the university standards at all, because we don't want this certificate to be about papers and about tests or any of the colonizing features. And if the learning is co-constructed, how do we even unpack the the university system to have this space? And we're trying to learn how to do that. And so that's just where I'm sitting with the tension. And Sarah, Valeria, you have your own lived experiences with this as well.
I just wanted to mention from the standpoint of a student at a university working towards a dissertation, what I find is tension sort of pushed back towards me when I try to do storying or, write in a way that feels comfortable for me as an Indigenous person. I oftentimes, have comments like, this doesn't belong in your paper. So when you try to involve your own story from your lived experience, sometimes that there's pushback on that, and that's unfortunate. And I think that there's a lot of education that needs to happen in explaining why this is the way to write this paper. This is absolutely the correct way to write this paper. It's not coming from a Western European standpoint. So I feel like I'm making progress, but there's still pushback, but I'm not going to give up. So we'll see how that turns out in the end. But that's just my perspective as being a student in academia in the state of Oregon.
Thank you, Sarah.
It might be.
Valeria, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say that I think right now we're in a really unique time, and for early learning, honestly, it's sometimes the older grades where it becomes more rigid, right, in terms of how we teach, how we learn within the settings, academic settings. But we are seeing
I'm just kidding.
We're seeing great things happen in education as a whole, and we have a lot to learn from those experiences around Oregon of how we can change the structure of education. I mean, because there's examples out there, we see it happening every day in our schools and our early learning environments. So how do we also highlight that and learn from it in a systemic way, as Ingrid talked about, because that's a locally designed sort of method. And how do we take that and amplify it to be, to apply to our systemic structures?
Thank you very much, Jess. It means like to have this structural change as well. We have one question here from Leslie. She's asking, if you had the gift of removing, for the panelists, I mean, if you had the gift of removing one barrier with no questions asked and a fully resourced investment for either research on or the early care and education system, what would it be based on your historical and current experience? If you had this gift of removing one barrier, what it would be?
Valeria, Sarah, would you like to start? Because I think it's your voice that should guide us.
I can start, but for me, it's a barrier that's not easily removed, or maybe not even possibly removed, and that's just the whole settler colonialism. And for me, it's a big picture, so we'll let someone else go.
I like that one, Sarah. I also think when I think about a barrier, it's really like some of the things that we already see are intricately changing, and it's like how we're looking at quality care and early care and education, and how we're looking at culturally responsive pedagogy as a whole. And I think we're seeing, some initial early investment into, focusing on that quality and cultural pedagogy. And so for me, it would be a continued investment, and also I think the state level systems it could be maybe so much affects our funding in Oregon, down from initial legislative agenda to direct grants. And so I think for me, in my experience, I feel like removing let's allow for more flexibility, I guess, of our funding.
Was just her.
And from a research perspective, it would be to access a continuous stream of funding, because the starts and the stop check momentum. And while we continue to apply and look for funding and talk to funders, understanding that it's really hard to do the work when the funding comes in 1 year spurts or 6 months or whatever it may be. And so for that, that would be a gift.
Of course. Well, I think.
Can I add something, Sergio?
Yeah. Go ahead, Sarah.
So, I've been thinking a lot about just in general ideas and attitudes and beliefs across our state, and especially with the things that we see in the media, particularly like in Newberg, and a lot of pushback to things like critical race theory. I mean, those are really big barriers when we try to do good work, when you're fighting against a societal belief that comes in direct head-to-head contact with what you're trying to do, because we're all sort of in our own silo where we know this is good work and we understand what we're doing, but how do we get that out to other people, that this isn't something that you should push back against, this is really good. So I don't know how we would remove that barrier, but just want to throw that out there.
In Dreamland, right? Yes, I think that it's a work that we're all like trying to get there. And I will take this opportunity to thank you, the three of you, and all the team that you're representing. It was a pleasure and a really honor to me to being able to meet you before, and then to discuss these questions with you, and all the things that you're saying and the ideas that you're giving us are they set perfectly the tone for the next activity, that it's the breakout rooms and the questions we prepared. So I think we could leave it here for this panel. And I don't know, Megan, if you have something to add, but I would like to offer also a virtual and as we did yesterday, if you open your microphone, like an applause for the panelists. Thank you very much. It was beautiful.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take a break. Please return. We want to continue to have these conversations. And thank you for the bravery of sharing today. And my only final thing is, it's so important for those of us who have directly benefited and are still directly benefiting from colonialism to be a part of exactly these conversations. And it's not just intellectual work, which it's heart work, and it's important, meaningful work. So thank you. Let's take about a 5-minute break, and we'll return and have some conversations. Thank you.
Okay, well, I know some of you have so much to tell still, but well, we have limited time, so we had 7 different groups. We just have some around 15 minutes left, so we will just wanted to, like, if you we're able to name a spokesperson, or if someone wants to volunteer, like to share a couple of ideas and tell us, please, what were the questions you selected or you discussed on, if there was just one or the ones that you selected, and to share a couple of ideas, please. And we'll try to give like 2 minutes each for each group, like in order to have all of you represented here in this brief summary, and then we can close. So I don't know if room 1 wants to start. I'm not sure. We were not sure if you know which room were you in. Yes, you did. Okay, thank you, Nelda and Veronica. Okay, so from room 1, who wants to share a couple of ideas and the questions you discussed? That's the group where was Angela and Annalise and Esther, Ingrid, Jamie, Kylie, and Megan. Prep. Well, you were not there, but usually.
All right, so for group 1, and please everyone jump in. We started with some aha moments from Thursday's presentation and hearing other stories in navigating systems. And it's so important to hear voices of the impacts of navigating systems and how people see themselves and their success. And we left with the question, how do we work with communities that struggled most to navigate systems and find representation? Let's see. I can only, all right, let me see if all right, how's that? Can you hear me better?
Yes.
All right. And then I had to reselect English when I came back into the room under the translation. Then we looked at a dominant culture perspective and a conversation that Oregon is culturally, sometimes we think Oregon is culturally responsive, but we're not really there as a state. And sometimes rules or food programs, for example, sleeping practices, or needing a doctor's note for alternative food choices in a food program, really push against best cultural practices. And sometimes exceptions that are culturally based are not always approved. And that requires a lot of extra energy, often further deprivileging or depleting of resources for family. And this continues to reinforce this belief that individuals are not seen or heard or represented. And then we look briefly at question 3 and the dismantling of structures and separating structures from people, because what we want are people in relationship, because a structure is not something, a structure is the people in there, and really looking at how do we recognize that systems are not people, and we need to work with people in relationship. And we need to look at relationship versus efficiencies, which are what like the university structure is about. And how do we find that balance of having both structures, because we can't, just like driving, you can't have no rules of the road. We need structural elements and relationships. And how do we have the opportunities to collaborate, and how do we look at definitions, because definitions belong to the definers, not those who are defined. And that was sort of a brief summary of our conversation. Please let me know, everyone in our group, if I missed any important points.
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you very much. Well, those are the ideas you had there. Let's keep on with room number 2. It's the one with Amy, Cassandra, Katie, Leslie, Lynette, Alexis. Who wants to share?
Well, I can share one, and then the rest of my group can chime in. But for question number 3, which was addressed, it was a how question, and what do we stand to gain in this sort of shift from the dominant culture. And I thought in my reflection over the last 2 days that the organizers of this research roundtable have provided us with a model of how to do just that. And in that journey, sort of my story, is to put the intentional coordination of elevating Spanish language, fill in the blank, could be any other language for any other purpose or any other cultural group, by putting all of the participants in the shoes of those who have to navigate services and information and knowledge through interpretation. And what that feels like is a great knowledge builder, but it's also the creator of understanding and empathy and impact. And I think that our hats off to the organizers, the intentional organization of elevating that and the individual stories and the knowledge base. It's walking the walk. And I think that this is a great model that every participant can take with them in how they lift up the stories within their own communities, their own practices. I think that's what creates change. So this is a really bold move, and I hope we use it with legislative leaders, because I think we can address funding if we were to put them in that place so that they can understand this dynamic, because you can tell it all day and you can put it on a research paper, but to experience it as you do in stories is quite different. So thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Lots of clapping over here. And well, that was part of the idea. And I think we're really grateful to listening to your ideas. I don't know if anyone else wants to add something from that group, or we can move on to room number 3. Heather, James, Nancy, Veronica.
If no one is adding anything more, I can go from group three and want to thank my group, Veronica, Jasmine, Nancy, and then Heather, who filled out the form for us. I guess I did the very analytical dominant culture thing. It's like, well, let's just go through them one by one. But we did spend much of our time on that first question of how to define quality, basically, when working with the diverse cultures. And it is a big question, because you have both the sort of the educational requirements, but then that cultural experience. And as was pointed out, some of our speakers addressed that, and it's like you have to do both. We right now, it's sort of a low bar. It's like, let's just make sure all the materials are out in the appropriate languages, and we're not doing that. If we're going to be diverse in our cultural representations, it's got to be diverse in meals, and I think Ingrid already talked about that in the first group. And we also, so quality is going to have different definitions, but it's not a separate but equal thing. We're applying both in all these cases. And so we didn't have a ton of conversation about the research questions, but when it does come to the research and how it's either we're dealing with the single dominant narrative, the dominant culture, or the context of culture and complexity, though, it's again, as was talked about by our speakers, you've got to take time to develop the relationships. You can't expect it to rush. We want people to feel comfortable. I think it was Veronica was pointing out that if you're doing a survey, the temptation is to be as brief as possible. But if you're allowing people to speak, and I think the term was, feel like they're in their mom's kitchen, they're going to give a broader narrative. They're going to tell a richer story, and you're going to get more of the information that you need. And it's possible, to gently redirect as needed, but you want people to feel comfortable telling their story, and that's where the better research is done. And it takes time, and it takes building relationships. So finally, what are some of these challenges that people face? Well, people are afraid of saying the wrong thing. And so we have to, and this is something I brought up, that with ODHS, we did a survey recently internally to our districts, how are relations with your tribal partners? And it's mixed, but there was open-ended questions, and some of the people were saying, we're simply uncomfortable because we're afraid we're going to say the wrong thing, or, and there's a history of broken promises. And so that's something that we're recognizing and working with our tribal office to develop a toolkit. And it sounds like it's something that I think happens all over the state and not just within ODHS, although we have those problems. So that's a real quick run through in our conversation. I know I left out some important things. If anyone wants to add anything, please feel free.
Thank you, James. Really, really insightful, right? Thinking it from that perspective and the issue of quality as well. Let's move to room number 4 with Ruby, Jenny, Alexis, Nella.
Yes, I will be sharing briefly. I know we're quick on time right now. So we kind of started addressing question 4. So how do we understand the intersection between research and equity in a context of cultural complexity? What a question. We answered it. We solved the problem. We're ready to go. And so what we really did kind of take a step back from the question a little bit to think about what are the barriers in the systemic system and systematic barriers we have. We had Nelda shared she said a thing that I now will forever remember, that we have to own our ignorance, that we don't know it all. We cannot be culturally responsive by translating a document. We have to consider these big picture factors. We also kind of had a discussion that Ruby initiated around funding. While we want to so much believe that the field is beyond zeros and ones and effect sizes and things, it's not, because it's tied to funding. And how do we shift big picture changes starting at the top? Because we need more representation in the field, but there's barriers to that. We need transparency, but there's barriers, because without funding, we can't do practice. And so I will move. There you go. It was big, it was mighty, and it tied into really all those other questions of, we want to do good work. A lot of us feel that in our heart work, but how do we get the zeros and ones to matter beyond a 0 and 1?
Thank you very much. It's already 11:45, so we know we had a schedule. So if anyone needs to leave now, we have the document there. It's all your thoughts are there for everyone to share, and you can also add anything if you want, or you can come back later and see what the rest of the teams are sharing. So if you need to go, please do it. And well, thank you very much for your participation, for your active and sensitive participation in these two days. And well, if you have a few more minutes, let's continue with the rest of the rooms, okay? So thank you, and then we'll go to room number 5.
Our group talked about many of the other things, really understanding the definition of quality and helping teachers to understand the variety of needs and to be able to communicate with families and understand their needs, and understand that if there's a disconnect between the child and the child care, then the issue might not be the child. So focusing on that, also really building trust with community. We're not going to be able to bring those stories in and to hear those stories to be able to shift the system unless we really hold space for that and also build the trust for that. And that it needs to be more than just inclusion, but a real shift to supporting researchers within community to hear the voices in their own community. And I will see if anybody else in the group has anything to add to what we talked about. We also talked about pushing back against the systems. There was reference to the discussion about the IRB and how you work from within the system to push back and make sure that the system itself is reflecting what you're trying to do in the community.
All right, thank you, Sydney. I think it's from room number 6. We have Dina. Are you there?
I am, and there was Catherine and Ronnie as well. I don't know if they're still here.
I think they left. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, just to be real brief, we talked quite a bit about the sort of structural limitations of the timelines that we often face for a particular project or report. And, you know, it really got me to thinking about some specific examples in the last couple of years, reaching out to community partners to really slow down and take the time to consult with the community we're working with, and the times in which our timeline didn't fit with their ability to work with us, and the folks that we didn't get to talk to or include or learn from because, you know, we had a 2-month window. Or and so we were just talking quite a bit about, you know, the larger structural changes around the timeline of a grant, you know, being limited to 24 months or whatever it might be, may take some time. But what we can realistically set out when we're applying for funding about really creating space and time to slow down and talk and build relationships and develop trust. We're just talking about what we can do right now and what might, you know, take a longer time to get to, but needs to be on our minds as well.
Thank you very much. And then we'll have our final room. It was room number 7. Who wants to share a bit of what you discussed?
I'll present for a room who had Ashley, Michaela, Jenny, Sarah, and me. We really did a pretty deep dive into question number 3 about trying to escape that single dominant narrative. And we really started by talking about the composition of the room, like who's just simply there, which wandered into the space of, well, it's not just about bringing people in, but once we do bring them in, are we ensuring that they're safe there, that their voices are actually going to be heard there, that they're not going to be harmed? And then reaching beyond, you know, how do we bring people into research, but what about bringing people into the actual learning spaces, bringing their stories into these spaces? And a very similar conversation then started to arrive, right, of a non-academic agenda of telling these stories, and what to do when the contexts are either sometimes very welcoming or all the way to hostile. Those are very different ways to bring in stories. What if it's just one Native child in that classroom in a hostile space? How do you bring in those stories, right, safely? And then we started talking a bit more about policy and specific cultural practices. Like we brought up swaddling as well. I think sleep was all on our minds somehow. And then also some of those larger solutions that are happening, kind of going back up again in those institutional spaces around time-intensive, meaningful trainings that can really help shift some perspective of people that currently do hold the power. Yeah, we kind of brought it all the way around.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, there's time is very limited, but I just wanted to thank all of you for attending, for participating, for sharing these deep insights, and also for opening to these sensitive issues. And let's just remember that even though we're here for early education, these are things that are transversal, right? They go all through our experiences in education and beyond. So thank you. It was really a pleasure to know you all and to be part of this effort. And thank you very much, Megan.
Thank you, everybody, so much. This has been such an amazing experience to navigate, and you all were supposed to be here. And so I appreciate it, and I'm energized and hope you all are too, and that this gives me, I was in a talk recently, I know we're done, but and someone was talking about you have to have that utopian hope out there of change to keep going. And this has been like a dose of that for me. And so I really appreciate everyone that has put themselves out there to speak out in the last 2 days and share your stories. And yeah, thank you. Have a great rest of your day and look forward to more conversations with all of you. Thank you, Nelda, Sergio. I am so thankful.
Thank you.
I've learned so much, and like I said, I think I've said, like, the planning meetings on their own, I was like, I am learning so much by doing this. And yeah, and we're getting, and the feedback has been really, really moving. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm really honored and grateful.
Yeah, me too. Thank
This
you.
is what I wish we were in person, so we could. I want to hug you all.
Hug each other.
No.
Air hug.
Kimmy, you're awesome. Your comments at the end, I was like, and we needed to end with Kimmy.
Yeah, that was
Kimmy's a
perfect
grad
wrap-up.
student.
I had Sarah in my group really helping me there. So
Yeah, Kimmy, you got it. Yeah, you talk about walking the walk. She's been an incredible guide while we put this together. So thank you, Kimmy.
That's great.
All right.
So thank you, Eric, for all
now
the
back to life. Okay, thank you all.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.